The battered Ford F-150, its bed crammed with the sum total of my worldly possessions, shuddered to a halt before the weather-beaten sign. Blackwood Creek Sanctuary, National Park Service. Area closed for indefinite ecological survey and restoration. No unauthorized access. The paint was peeling, one corner sagged, and an additional newer plaque beneath it detailed dire warnings about unstable terrain and sensitive ongoing research. This was it, my new assignment, secured through a series of unusually discreet interviews and a surprising lack of bureaucratic red tape. I'd arrived in the first week of October, the autumn air already carrying a distinct chill. Blackwood Creek was a park so remote, so deeply embedded in the sprawling evergreen wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, it was more rumor than destination. Tourists were non-existent due to its closed status. Any inquiries were met with polite but firm diversions by a distant regional office. The forest itself, even from this periphery, felt primordial, an untamed expanse of colossal Douglas firs and shadowed western hemlocks that seemed to actively devour the sunlight. My boots crunched on the gravel path leading to the main ranger station, a rustic log cabin that looked like it had sprouted from the earth, complete with a stone chimney exhaling a thin ribbon of wood smoke. 3 figures emerged onto the porch. The first was an older man, Jeremy, his face a sun and wind-etched map of wrinkles, his eyes the pale, watchful blue of a high-altitude lake. He looked like he'd been part of this landscape since the last ice age. Beside him, Caleb, built like a lumberjack's anvil, stood silent, his dark eyes appraising me with an unnerving stillness. The last was Sarah, a woman in her mid-40s, her practical work clothes hinting at a wiry, resilient strength. They watched my approach not with suspicion, but with an odd, almost resigned welcome, as if my arrival was a long-foreseen, inevitable event. Introductions were brief, their handshakes firm. Jeremy offered a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes but didn't quite reach the ancient weariness within them. Sarah's greeting was warmer, though a distinct undercurrent of caution hummed beneath it. Caleb merely nodded, his gaze lingering, assessing. The station's interior was dim, smelling of wood smoke, old paper, drying herbs I didn't recognize, and a faint, earthy musk that was both wild and unsettling. Maps papered the walls, some modern topographical surveys, others looking far older, hand-drawn on yellowed parchment. Their inks faded. I noticed that on the official maps, large swathes of the park were simply marked unsurveyed hazardous terrain. Strange, archaic-looking tools, some crafted from dark wood and what looked like obsidian, hung from pegs alongside more conventional ranger gear. We were equipped with standard NPS radios, but I'd already been warned that transmissions from deep within the park were often unreliable, prone to atmospheric interference, especially in certain valleys. GPS units, I was told, were notoriously fickle here, often giving wildly inaccurate readings or simply failing altogether in specific zones, a convenient explanation, I would later realize, for keeping outsiders from mapping sensitive areas. My first few weeks, it was now late October, were an intense immersion. Blackwood Creek was vast, a labyrinth of towering forests that climbed into mist-shrouded, unmapped peaks and deep rocky ravines where the sun was a fleeting visitor. I learned the primary patrol routes, many of which were little more than faint game trails or paths marked by almost imperceptible blazes on tree trunks, blazes that seemed designed to be missed by untrained eyes. I covered miles of dense undergrowth, the silence often profound, broken only by the rush of unseen creeks or the distant mournful cry of a raven. The air was sharp with pine and damp earth, yet an undercurrent of disquiet always thrummed beneath the surface. The woods felt watchful, the shadows deeper, more animate than they should be. I often had the distinct sensation of being observed, a prickling on my neck that would make me scan the impenetrable tree line, only to find nothing but the silent, colossal sentinels of the forest. Normal wildlife was present, but unusually wary and scarce, especially compared to other national parks I'd worked in. It was as if the deer and elk knew to tread lightly, to keep to the periphery of something else's domain. My colleagues remained an enigma. Jeremy was a fount of practical woodland knowledge, yet he'd deflect any questions about local legends or the park's more obscure history with vague talk of old wives' tales or sensitive native sites. Sarah, efficient and diligent, would often be caught staring out the window into the deep woods with an expression of mingled apprehension and profound resignation. Caleb was a ghost in the machine, rarely speaking, yet his presence was a constant, observant weight. They'd fall silent if I entered a room unannounced, or exchange quick, loaded glances that shut me out. Certain areas on the park maps, even the older ones, were treated with a kind of hushed reverence or outright avoidance during briefings. I didn't push. There was an unspoken covenant of secrecy here, a boundary I instinctively knew not to cross. My role, it seemed, was to learn the surface, to prove myself reliable in the mundane, before any deeper truths might be revealed. And so, I patrolled, I observed, I filed my carefully worded reports, sinking deeper each day into the brooding mystery of Blackwood Creek, the unspoken tension, a living thing in the air around us. It was now late October, nearly 3 weeks after my arrival, the sun already beginning its descent, casting long, skeletal shadows through the ancient pines. Jeremy and I were on a patrol deep in the park's western sector, a rugged area rarely visited. The air was crisp, heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. Moss, thick as a bear's pelt, clung to the massive glacier-scarred boulders that littered the forest floor. It should have felt peaceful, but the tranquility was a thin, brittle veneer. There was a profound stillness here, a heavy, waiting quality, as if the very bones of the earth were listening. We'd been walking for several hours since leaving the main service track where our battered Park Service ATV was parked. Jeremy, his well-worn Remington 700 30-06 slung comfortably over his shoulder, had been mostly silent, occasionally pointing out a rare fungal growth or the subtle signs of a cougar's passage. I was beginning to feel the burn in my thighs from the constant uphill climb. Then I saw it, a narrow fork in the path, almost swallowed by the encroaching wilderness, branching off to the right. Unlike the faint trail we were on, this one seemed to dissolve almost immediately into a dense, tangled thicket of rhododendron and thorny devil's club, climbing steeply towards a series of low, humped hills barely visible through the oppressive canopy. "What's up that way?" I asked, my voice sounding louder than intended in the pervasive quiet. Jeremy didn't break stride, but I saw his shoulders stiffen. He gave the overgrown track a cursory glance, his expression carefully neutral. "Old burial mounds," he said, his voice low and dismissive. He paused, then added, his tone hardening slightly. "Nothing for us up there. Best to stick to the marked routes." It wasn't a suggestion. I pressed, "Why? What's the big deal about some old mounds?" Jeremy's gaze slid away, fixing on some indeterminate point deep within the shadowing trees. He offered no further explanation, his silence a palpable wall, as if even speaking of the place was a transgression. He was testing me, I sensed, or perhaps waiting for something. This patrol route felt deliberately chosen, skirting the edge of something forbidden. We were about to turn back, the fading light a pressing concern, when it sliced through the forest stillness. A scream. It was undeniably female, high-pitched and raw, with a desperate, unadulterated terror that shot ice through my veins. A plea for help, urgent and unmistakable, originating from the direction of that forbidden mound-bound path. My training kicked in, the ingrained instinct to render aid overriding everything else. I lunged towards the sound. "Alex, no!" Jeremy's voice was a harsh bark, his hand shooting out to grab my arm, but I was already moving, adrenaline flooding my system. I heard him curse, a low, guttural sound. Then the heavy thud of his boots as he reluctantly, angrily, followed. I crashed through the undergrowth, thorns tearing at my jacket, branches whipping my face. The terrain was treacherous, the ground uneven and slick with damp leaves. As I shoved past a curtain of drooping cedar boughs, I caught a glimpse of something metallic and rotted, half buried in the ferns. A sign, ancient and rusted, its wooden post crumbling. Most of the lettering was gone, consumed by time and rust, but two words, stark and ominous, remained legible. "Keep out." My heart hammered. Ahead, between the dark, rounded shapes of what I now clearly recognized as burial mounds, a fog was coalescing. It wasn't natural. It was too dense, too localized, clinging to the ground like a living shroud, coiling and uncoiling in thick, greasy tendrils that swirled with an unnatural, silent energy. It muffled the sounds of the forest, creating an eerie, insulated pocket of profound wrongness. Jeremy caught up, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his face pale and strained. He grabbed my shoulder, his grip like iron. "Leave it, Alex, now!" he hissed, his voice desperate. I couldn't understand his terror. Someone was in danger. He shook his head vehemently, his eyes wide with a primal fear I'd never witnessed in another human being. "That scream," he choked out. "It's not human. It's old. A lure. The spirit of the mounds. It calls them in, but they don't come out. Ghost stories. Now." The sheer absurdity almost made me laugh, but before I could voice my disbelief, a flicker of movement in the pearly, opaque fog caught my eye. A shadow, impossibly fast, darted between two of the larger mounds. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice cracking in the oppressive, soupy air. The shadow shifted again, a blur of motion that defied natural physics, and then, as if it had congealed from the mist itself, it was there. Directly in front of me, not 30 feet away. Towering, skeletal. A nightmare dredged from the deepest recesses of human fear. Its body was emaciated, skin stretched like yellowed parchment over a frame that had to be 9, maybe 10 feet tall. In place of a head, there was the bleached, elongated skull of some monstrous deer or elk, crowned with a rack of massive, gnarled antlers that scraped the low-hanging branches. And its eyes, or the empty sockets where eyes should have been, burned with a terrifying, frigid, blue-white fire. The Wendigo. The world compressed to that single horrifying image. Jeremy reacted with the speed of a cornered wolf. The Remington 700 was at his shoulder in an instant. The rifle's report a flat, shocking crack in the unnatural stillness of the fog-choked mounds. I didn't see if the bullet found its mark, or if the creature even registered the impact. Jeremy's hand clamped onto my arm like a steel trap, yanking me backward, away from the spectral horror. We turned and fled, plunging back into the thorny embrace of the undergrowth, the fog seeming to writhe and claw at our heels, thickening with every desperate step. Behind us, a sound erupted that would forever be seared into my auditory memory. A drawn-out, guttural howl that was part animalistic rage, part the splintering of ancient glacial ice, a cry of pure, unadulterated hunger and fury. It was impossibly close. My legs felt like lead weights, yet adrenaline, raw and potent, propelled me forward. I stumbled, caught myself on a slick root, thorns ripping at my clothes and exposed skin. My mind was a chaotic vortex of disbelief and primal terror. This couldn't be real. Creatures like that belonged in fever dreams, in the hushed, fearful tales of lost tribes, not standing 10 feet tall in a national park in the 21st century. The Wendigo's icy, burning gaze was imprinted on the inside of my eyelids. Jeremy, however, moved with a desperate, unerring certainty. He knew this nightmarish terrain, even in the disorienting mist. He navigated us through a labyrinth of dense trees and unseen pitfalls, his breath rasping, until finally the fog began to thin, the oppressive atmosphere lifting almost imperceptibly. He veered onto what felt like a narrow, almost invisible game trail, one that seemed to actively repel the clinging vapor. The monstrous howls, though still audible, grew fainter, the immediate pursuit apparently abandoned. We didn't stop until we reached the relative safety of the service track where our ATV was hidden, miles from the Mounds. I collapsed against the vehicle, chest heaving, every muscle screaming in protest. The cold sweat hadn't stopped. When I could finally string words together, they tumbled out, a torrent of questions, accusations, desperate demands for an explanation. Jeremy, leaning heavily on his rifle, looked 100 years old, the weight of generations of secrets pressing down on him. He didn't try to deny what we'd seen. His exhaustion was too profound for prevarication. He admitted it then, his voice heavy with a weariness that went far beyond physical exertion. The stories, the whispers, the local legends I'd subconsciously dismissed as backwoods folklore. They were true. All of it. He, Sarah, and Caleb. They weren't just park rangers in the conventional sense. They were guardians, keepers of ancient, terrifying secrets, standing as a thin line against things that defied sanity. And now, by virtue of what I had witnessed, I was irrevocably tangled in that secret. A fresh wave of fear, colder and deeper this time, washed over me. My first, overwhelming instinct was to jump on the ATV, ride it out of this cursed forest, get in my truck, and drive until Blackwood Creek was a distant, nightmarish memory. To forget the skull face and the burning, empty eyes. But then a different, stubborn part of me, the part that had been drawn to the raw, untamed wildness of this place, the part that was now inextricably bound to this terrifying truth, asserted itself. I couldn't just leave. I had to understand. I had to know more. Back at the ranger station, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. Sarah and Caleb looked at me as I stumbled in, their expressions a somber mixture of grim understanding and something I couldn't quite name. Perhaps a weary empathy. Later that evening, after a silent, tense meal, Jeremy unrolled a different map on the scarred wooden table. This wasn't one of the official USGS surveys. This one was ancient, drawn on what looked like treated animal hide, possibly deer skin. The ink faded, the lines hand-etched with remarkable precision. It depicted Blackwood Creek, but not as any modern cartographer would render it. Areas were marked with strange symbols, pictograms that sent a shiver of primal recognition down my spine. "This map," Jeremy said, his voice low, "has been passed down through generations. It was first created by the native tribes who understood the spirit of this valley, its sanctities and its horrors. Later, solitary trappers and mountain men, those who learned to listen to the land, added their own observations." He pointed to a rugged mountainous region in the north. "Sasquatch," he said, his finger tracing over a crudely drawn, oversized footprint. He then moved to an area bordering the wide, turbulent Blackwood River. "Werewolf packs," he stated, tapping a symbol of a howling wolf under a full moon. The burial mounds where we'd had our encounter were clearly demarcated, a chillingly accurate representation of the Wendigo's skull and antlers sketched beside them. There were other symbols too, ones I didn't recognize, scattered across the map, hinting at other unknown entities. And then in the very heart of the park, in its deepest, most inaccessible region, was a stark black circle. It was labeled with a single ominous word: the Hole. I asked what it was. Sarah spoke then, her voice quiet but firm. According to the old lore, the lore their families had guarded for centuries, it was the maw, the womb of the earth, a place where ancient primal things, beings older than mankind, had retreated into the planet's depths long ago. As long as they remained dormant, she explained, a fragile, uneasy peace held. But the implication was clear. If they stirred, all peace, all sanity was forfeit. The weight of their hidden world settled upon me, a crushing, unbelievable reality. The days that followed were an immersion into a reality that felt like a waking nightmare, yet possessed an undeniable, terrifying logic. My ranger duties transformed. Every shadow in the periphery of my vision seemed to hold a potential threat. Every unexplained rustle in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig in the distance, set my nerves on edge like live wires. Jeremy, Sarah, and Caleb began to slowly, cautiously educate me in the true nature of our stewardship. This wasn't the kind of training you received at the academy. This was generational knowledge, passed down through grim experience, hushed warnings, and rituals I was only beginning to glimpse. I learned that the monsters, a term that felt laughably inadequate for the ancient, powerful beings that shared this park, generally preferred to avoid human contact. They had their territories, their ancient unspoken compacts, their own intricate unseen lives. But avoidance wasn't a guarantee. Attacks, though rare, did happen, usually when boundaries were crossed, either by the hypothetical lost hiker who'd somehow strayed impossibly far from any conceivable path, or by other less definable incursions. They showed me the real boundaries, not the ones marked on any official Park Service map. We journeyed to the foothills of the jagged northern peaks, the supposed territory of the Sasquatch. There, the evidence was irrefutable. Footprints, easily 18 inches long and impossibly wide, pressed deep into the muddy banks of a glacial stream, each toe clearly defined. Trees, some a good foot in diameter, were snapped like dry kindling, not felled by wind or disease, but clearly broken by immense brute force far beyond any known animal. The air here was thick with a musky, primal scent and an almost palpable sense of ancient, brooding power. Jeremy explained the protocols. Never approach directly, never show aggression, and if venturing close, leave offerings of fruit or roots, never meet. Near the Blackwood River, where the water ran dark and swift between steep forested banks, was the domain of the werewolves. We didn't go too close, especially as dusk began to bleed into the sky. From a safe distance, concealed within a rocky outcrop overlooking a bend in the river, I heard them. Not the lonely howl of a timber wolf, but a chorus of voices, deeper, more resonant, imbued with a chilling, almost human intelligence. And then, as the moon, a pale sliver began to rise, pinpricks of light appeared on the far bank eyes, dozens of them, glowing with an eerie, lambent yellow, watching, always watching. Sarah told me that silver was more than myth here, it was a practical deterrent, and that certain nights, especially around the full moon, this entire stretch of river was to be given a berth of several miles. The area around the burial mounds, the Wendigo's blighted territory, I revisited only once in my thoughts, the memory itself a cold weight. The unnatural fog, Jeremy confirmed, still clung to those low hills, a permanent, localized miasma. The air there, he said, was always colder, carrying a faint metallic tang and an overwhelming sense of desolation, of insatiable spiritual hunger that seemed to emanate from the very soil. Even the trees, he described, seemed to lean away from the mounds, their branches skeletal and perpetually bare, as if blighted by the creature's presence. In other, less clearly defined regions of the park, during my now heavily armed solo patrols, I began to notice things I would have previously dismissed or rationalized away. A fleeting movement in the high canopy, too large for a bird, too agile for a squirrel, leaving behind a faint, cloyingly sweet scent that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Strange, rhythmic chittering sounds from beneath the earth in a secluded, fern-choked valley, accompanied by tracks that looked like a grotesque fusion of insect and small mammal. Once, while overlooking the park's deepest, most isolated lake, a place seldom visited even by us, I saw a colossal dark shape move beneath the surface, far too large to be any known freshwater creature, its passage creating a wake that lapped against the distant shore long after it had disappeared into the murky, unplumbed depths. My heart would pound in my chest, a cold dread gripping me, but an equally powerful, almost morbid curiosity pushed me to observe, to catalog, to try and understand the sheer, terrifying biodiversity of Blackwood Creek. I started keeping a detailed private journal, sketching the unfamiliar tracks, noting the strange sounds and smells, a chronicle of the unbelievable. My standard issue gear felt woefully inadequate. The specialized, heavier caliber ammunition, Sarah favored silver-tipped rounds for her rifle in certain areas, and the cold iron tools Jeremy and Caleb sometimes carried suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. The park was no longer just a wilderness. It was an ecosystem of nightmares, a tapestry woven from legend and dread, and I was slowly, painstakingly, learning to navigate its darkest food chains. Of all the forbidden zones and monstrous territories marked on Jeremy's ancient hidebound map, the one that exerted the most dreadful, irresistible fascination over me was the stark black circle at its heart, the Hole. The name itself was brutally simple, devoid of euphemism, a blunt admission of something primal and terrifying. Weeks after my chilling initiation at the Wendigo's Mounds, after numerous patrols that skirted the edges of known creature domains, I felt an undeniable, almost magnetic compulsion to see it for myself. The others had warned me against it, not with the same vehemence they'd used for the Wendigo's territory, but with a quiet, heavy reluctance that was somehow more unnerving. It was a place of immense, dormant power, they said, a sleeping wound in the world, best left entirely undisturbed. But dormant was a dangerously relative term in Blackwood Creek. I chose a day when my patrol route took me into the remote Central Highlands, a rugged, seldom visited area of the park characterized by crumbling escarpments and stunted, wind-lashed pines. The journey to the Hole wasn't marked on any conventional map, not even the detailed Park Service surveys. I relied on Jeremy's terse verbal directions and a faint, almost imperceptible game trail that seemed to actively shy away from its ultimate destination. The closer I got, the more the forest itself seemed to sicken and die. The vibrant greens and browns of the healthy wilderness gradually gave way to a muted, unhealthy palette. The trees grew sparser, their branches twisted and blackened as if by some ancient, all-consuming fire. The undergrowth thinned, then vanished entirely, replaced by a cracked, barren earth that crunched under my boots. The silence was absolute, a crushing abiotic void where not even the buzz of an insect or the chirp of a bird dared to intrude. A profound, unnatural chill permeated the air, sinking into my bones despite the weak autumn sun. And then I saw it. The hole was a perfect yawning circle carved into the earth, easily 100 feet in diameter, perhaps significantly more. It was hard to gauge its true scale. Its edges were sheer black rock plunging into an abyss so deep that no light, not even the ambient gray of the overcast sky, penetrated its depths. It didn't look like a natural geological formation, not a sinkhole or a volcanic caldera. It looked deliberate, purposeful, as if a colossal, malevolent entity had punched its fist into the world and torn out its heart. A wide, sterile ring of scorched, utterly lifeless earth surrounded it, where no grass, no moss, not even the hardiest lichen could find purchase. The trees that stood nearest were petrified, their blackened limbs like skeletal fingers pointing accusingly at the sky, or perhaps inwards, towards the source of their demise. The cold emanating from the chasm was not merely a drop in temperature. It was a palpable entity, a wave of ancient sepulchral iciness that prickled my skin and raised gooseflesh despite my insulated jacket. I approached the edge cautiously, my boots crunching on the brittle, sterile ground. The air itself felt heavy, stagnant, pressing down on me with an almost physical weight. I lay on my stomach, my heart thudding against the cold earth, and peered over the precipice into the impenetrable blackness. For long minutes there was nothing but the void, a perfect, lightless nothing. Then I thought I saw it, a flicker of movement, far, far below at the very limit of my vision, like something vast and dark, shifting in an even deeper darkness. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. Was it a trick of the light? My eyes straining to make sense of the absolute black? Perhaps. But then I heard it, or rather felt it as much as heard it. A faint, almost subaudible sound. A dry, rustling whisper, like 1,000 desiccated leaves skittering across ancient stone. Or perhaps the faintest collective muttering. A chorus of sibilant voices speaking in a language I couldn't comprehend, yet which resonated with a primal, soul-deep dread. And with it came the unmistakable, chilling sensation of being watched, not by a single pair of eyes, but by countless unseen presences dwelling in that Stygian darkness, their collective gaze a cold pressure on my mind. My skin crawled. Every instinct, every nerve ending screamed at me to retreat, to flee from this unholy place. I pulled back from the edge, my heart hammering against my ribs as if trying to escape my chest. I stayed for perhaps another hour, observing from a safer distance, concealed amongst the petrified logs, but the hole revealed no more of its secrets, remaining a silent, black wound in the earth, radiating its palpable chill. When I returned to the station, shaken and profoundly unnerved, I described what I had seen and heard to Sarah and Jeremy. Caleb was there too, listening with his usual unnerving, stoic stillness. They exchanged uneasy glances. Jeremy sighed, a tired, old sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. He told me it was likely my imagination, the power of suggestion working on an overstimulated mind in a place known for its oppressive atmosphere. Sarah added a little too quickly that the hole had been quiet for generations, that nothing could stir within it, that its depths were sealed. Their reassurances felt hollow, rehearsed, as if they were trying to convince themselves as much as me. A cold seed of profound doubt took root in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that the hole was not as quiescent, not as safely dormant as my colleagues desperately wanted to believe. The whispers, the fleeting movement, the crushing weight of that unseen collective gaze, they felt terrifyingly, undeniably real. Life in Blackwood Creek settled into a new, albeit terrifying, kind of normalcy. My patrols were no longer just about checking trails and observing the sparse, wary wildlife. They were about monitoring ancient boundaries, noting subtle shifts in the park's unnerving ecosystem, and always being hyper-aware of what might lurk just beyond the edge of sight, in the deep shadows or behind the next colossal tree. I became meticulous in my observations, my private journal filling with sketches of unusual tracks, detailed descriptions of unfamiliar sounds and scents, and notes on the fluctuating atmospheric pressures and strange magnetic anomalies around certain zones. The fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now laced with a grim sort of acceptance and a burgeoning, almost academic curiosity. One of my more unconventional projects was an attempt to establish a kind of wary detente with the Sasquatch whose territory bordered the northern mountains. Remembering Jeremy's advice, I began leaving small offerings at the edge of a known migratory path. Initially, pieces of jerky and dried meat, which remained untouched even by scavengers. Then, recalling old stories and Jeremy's counsel that suggested a more herbivorous or omnivorous non-predatory diet, I switched to piles of fresh berries I'd picked, wild nuts, and apples I'd brought from town. For several days, these too were ignored, or so I thought. Then, one morning, I found the spot empty, the fruit and nuts gone. In their place, carefully laid on a flat, moss-covered stone beside where the fruit had been, was a single, perfectly formed, iridescent blue jay feather. It wasn't conclusive proof, not in any scientific sense, but I felt a quiet thrum of understanding, a sense of a deliberate, intelligent exchange. Contact of a sort had been made. I noted it carefully in my journal. October 28th. Offering taken. Blue jay feather left in return. Possible sign of acknowledgement or acceptance. Continue cautious overtures. Despite these small, strange victories in adapting to my new reality, the image of the hole, its cold, black maw, and the unsettling sensations it evoked, continued to haunt my thoughts. A persistent, gnawing unease regarding it wouldn't leave me. It was more than just a memory of that first disturbing visit. It was a premonition, a growing certainty that the stillness Sarah and Jeremy insisted upon was a fragile, deteriorating illusion. The place seemed to call to me in my dreams, a silent, black summons. One crisp November morning, unable to shake the feeling of impending disaster and driven by a desperate need to do something, to take some initiative, I decided to return. This time, I went armed not just with my standard sidearm, but also with the pump-action 12-gauge shotgun we kept loaded with heavy slugs at the station. I also carried a small, experimental motion sensor I'd jury-rigged from spare parts, intending to place it discreetly near the rim, a rudimentary early warning system. The approach was as unsettling as before. The dying forest, the oppressive silence, the unnatural cold that seemed to leach the warmth from my very blood. I found a relatively concealed position among some blackened, petrified logs a safe distance from the rim, using my binoculars to scan the abyss. For a long while, nothing but the yawning black. Then my breath hitched in my throat. Deep within the blackness far below, there was definite movement. Not a trick of the eye this time. Something was stirring, something large and pale. I watched, heart pounding like a drum against my ribs, as a form began to ascend from the Stygian depths, moving with a jerky, unnatural insectoid gait. It clawed its way up the sheer rock face, and as it emerged into the dim gray light at the edge of the hole, I got my first clear, horrifying look. It was an abomination, roughly the size of a large goat. Its head was vaguely caprine, but hideously distorted, with a multitude of glistening black compound eyes that resembled those of a praying mantis, set above a maw filled with needle-sharp serrated teeth. Its elongated, segmented body, tapering to a pointed abdomen, was covered in coarse, matted, dun-colored fur, and it moved on 6 multi-jointed, chitinous legs, like those of some monstrous, nightmarish insect. A low, chittering, clicking sound emanated from it, accompanied by a faint, acrid, sulfurous stench that stung my nostrils. Before I could fully process the sheer wrongness of the creature, it sensed me. Its multifaceted head snapped in my direction, those insectoid eyes fixing on my position with cold, alien focus, and with a horrifying, bleeding shriek that morphed into a high-pitched, piercing keen, it launched itself from the edge of the hole and scrambled towards me with terrifying, unnatural speed. Instinct took over. I raised the shotgun, aimed for its central mass, and fired. The slug hit it with a sickening wet thud, sending a spray of dark, viscous, greenish ichor into the air. The creature stumbled, shrieked again, a sound that grated on my nerves like metal on bone but didn't go down. It kept coming. I pumped the shotgun, the sound of the action reassuringly solid, fired again. Another hit. It staggered, one of its insectal legs buckling, spraying more foul liquid, but its momentum carried it relentlessly forward. Again I fired, and again. The thing was unnaturally resilient, its chitinous hide surprisingly tough. Finally, after the 4th 12-gauge slug tore through its grotesque body, it shuddered violently, convulsed, and collapsed in a heap, mere yards from my position, its remaining legs twitching feebly, its multiple eyes dimming. My relief was a fleeting, gasping breath. As the echoes of my last shot died away, another of the creatures, identical to the first, scrabbled its way out of the hole. Then another. I opened fire again, adrenaline coursing through me like wildfire, the shotgun bucking hard against my shoulder. I downed the second one, then the third, blasting them apart at close range. But they kept coming, a seemingly endless stream from the abyss. The click of the empty chamber was like a death knell. I fumbled for my sidearm, my hands slick with sweat, but it was too late. A fourth creature, larger and seemingly more robust than the others, was almost upon me, its mantis eyes burning with cold malice, its fanged maw agape, ready to tear. This was it, I thought, a wave of cold, utter despair washing over me. It reared up, preparing to strike, its shadow falling over me. Suddenly, a deafening roar split the air, a sound of primal fury and immense power that shook the very ground beneath my feet. A colossal, dark silhouette erupted from the tree line bordering the blighted zone. It was immense, easily 9 feet tall, a mountain of muscle and shaggy, dark brown fur. Bigfoot. Before the goat insect horror could pounce on me, the Sasquatch was upon it, swatting the creature with a single devastating blow from a massive tree trunk of an arm. The monster was sent flying, tumbling end over end back into the blackness of the hole with a final dying shriek. The Sasquatch stood there for a moment, its broad chest heaving, its deep-set eyes, surprisingly intelligent and filled with a profound weariness, fixed on me. There was no hostility in its gaze, only a kind of grim acknowledgement. Then, without a sound, it turned and melted back into the shadows of the ancient forest, disappearing as silently and suddenly as it had arrived, leaving me alone with the dead and the dying echoes of the fight. I stumbled back to the ranger station, my clothes torn and smeared with the foul, greenish ichor of the creatures, the heavy shotgun feeling like an anchor in my trembling hands. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep shakiness and a rising wave of nausea. Jeremy, Sarah, and Caleb were in the main room, poring over one of the old maps, and they stopped whatever they were doing the moment they saw me. My disheveled appearance, my wild, haunted eyes, the story that tumbled out of me in ragged, breathless gasps. It was enough to strip away any lingering pretense of skepticism or denial on their part. There was no disbelief this time, only a grim, shared understanding that settled over them like a shroud. Jeremy's face, already deeply lined, seemed to age another decade in that instant. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrified comprehension. Caleb simply picked up his heavy-duty AR-15 platform rifle from the rack by the door, his jaw tight, his movements economical and precise. Without a word, the four of us, heavily armed, headed back towards the hole. The evidence was stark and undeniable. The clearing around the chasm was a scene of grotesque carnage. The twitching, rapidly decaying corpses of the goat insect things I'd shot lay where they had fallen, already beginning to exude a more potent, noxious stench that clung to the cold air. The ground was scarred by my frantic footprints and the immense, deeper impressions left by the Sasquatch. Caleb knelt, examining one of the dead creatures with a cold, professional detachment, while Sarah, looking pale but resolute, began to carefully collect samples of its strange, chitinous plating and viscous bodily fluids into evidence bags, her movements practiced and efficient. The implications were terrifyingly clear and unspoken. The hole was no longer dormant. The things within, the ancient chthonic demons of their family's darkest legends, were stirring, testing the boundaries, beginning to emerge. The fragile, centuries-old peace was irrevocably broken. Panic was a luxury none of us could afford. That evening, back at the station, the atmosphere thick with unspoken dread, a council of war was held. The decision was unanimous. We had to prepare for the worst. The few creatures I'd encountered might have been scouts, a probing attack. There was no telling what else or how many might follow from those abyssal depths. The next morning, Jeremy and I made a tense, hurried trip into the nearest town, a small, isolated logging community several hours' drive away. Our shopping list was not typical for park rangers. We visited a discreet, out-of-the-way gun store run by an old acquaintance of Jeremy's, a taciturn man whose questions were few and whose discretion was legendary. We purchased additional AR-15s, more pump-action shotguns with extended magazines, and a truly alarming quantity of ammunition: hollow points, slugs, buckshot, and specialized high-velocity rounds. Then came the more unorthodox acquisitions. Through what Jeremy vaguely termed long-standing discreet arrangements with certain providers, contacts cultivated by generations of Guardians who knew conventional means wouldn't suffice, we obtained several crates of military surplus motion sensors, trip flares, and after a hushed, grim discussion and a significant exchange of cash, a small but potent supply of fragmentation grenades and M203 grenade launcher attachments for 2 of the AR-15s. These weren't items found at your local sporting goods store. They spoke of a shadow network, of desperate measures for desperate times. The drive back to Blackwood Creek was mostly silent, the weight of our grim purchases heavy in the bed of the truck, the unspoken dread a palpable entity between us. Upon our return, the four of us worked with a focused, grim efficiency that bordered on frantic. Under Jeremy's direction, we began to fortify the area around the hole. We strategically placed the motion sensors in a wide, layered perimeter, camouflaging them amongst the blackened trees and sterile earth. Trip flares were set along likely approach routes. We cleared firing lines, designated fallback positions, and cached ammunition, medical supplies, and the grenades in secure, accessible locations. Sarah, drawing on knowledge that seemed almost instinctual, prepared poultices and tinctures from specific herbs known in their family lore for their protective or warding properties. Though against the things we might face, their efficacy felt like a fragile, desperate hope. Caleb, silent and methodical as ever, cleaned and checked every weapon, his movements precise and economical, ensuring each was in perfect working order. I found myself falling into the rhythm of their preparations, my earlier shock and terror hardening into a cold, sharp resolve. The fight at the hole had initiated me, baptizing me in ichor and terror. I was no longer just an observer, a shocked newcomer. I was one of them now, a guardian, whether I had consciously chosen this path or not. As dusk settled on that first day of intense preparation, casting long, eerie shadows across the blighted landscape surrounding the hole, a tense quiet descended. We established a watch rotation, 2 on, 2 off. The air was cold, still, and heavy with a suffocating anticipation. Every snap of a twig in the dead forest, every rustle of the wind through the skeletal branches, set our nerves on edge. We waited, armed and vigilant for the inevitable. The abyss lay silent, a black, watchful eye in the dying land, and we, its unlikely under-equipped sentinels, braced for the horrors it might yet spew forth from the bowels of the earth. Several agonizingly tense days passed in an unnerving, taut silence. The motion sensors around the hole remained quiet. Their small green indicator lights a deceitful beacon of comfort in the oppressive gloom that clung to that blighted place. We maintained our vigil, rotating watches, snatching fitful, nightmare-ridden sleep, the tension coiling ever tighter within us, a palpable thing in the cold, stagnant air. Each sunrise felt like a minor, hard-won victory, each sunset a prelude to potential, unimaginable horror. The forest itself, beyond the immediate dead zone of the hole, seemed to be holding its breath, the usual sparse wildlife sounds entirely absent. Then came the night of the full moon. It hung in the inky, cloudless sky like a baleful silver eye, casting the blighted landscape around the hole in stark, ghostly relief, every shadow deep and menacing. I was on watch with Caleb, the penetrating cold seeping into my bones despite my layers of clothing, when the first sensor tripped. A small, insistent beep from the receiver unit in Caleb's hand shattered the profound silence. Then another and another, a cascade of alerts spreading rapidly inwards towards the abyss, like ripples in a pond of dread. Adrenaline hit me like a physical blow, a jolt of electricity. Through our night vision goggles we saw them, dark, skittering shapes pouring from the blackness of the hole, far more numerous, far more varied than before. The goat insect abominations were there, but also newer, more grotesque horrors. Some low and reptilian, their scaled bodies gleaming wetly. Others vaguely arachnoid with far too many spindly legs. Still others like amorphous, slithering masses of shadow, all moving with a terrifying unified purpose, a tide of alien malevolence. "Contact! All stations, contact!" Jeremy's voice, tight and strained, crackled over the radio from his and Sarah's position on the opposite side of the perimeter. The night erupted in a cacophony of gunfire. Muzzle flashes from our AR-15s and shotguns lit up the darkness in strobing bursts as we opened fire, a desperate barrage against the surging tide of emerging monstrosities. The creatures shrieked, hissed, and fell, their unnatural bodies torn apart by bullets, their ichor spraying the sterile ground. But for every one that dropped, 2 more seemed to take its place, scrambling over their fallen kin. They were relentless, a seemingly inexhaustible flood of nightmares given form. We fought with a grim, desperate efficiency, reloading with practiced speed, firing controlled bursts, communicating in clipped urgent shouts over the comms. Dozens fell, their grotesque forms littering the sterile earth, their strange blood staining the ground black under the cold moonlight. Suddenly, a deep, resonant rumble began to emanate from the earth beneath our feet, distinct from the vibrations of our own weapons. It grew in intensity, the ground trembling, then shaking violently as if in the grip of a colossal seizure. It was an earthquake, localized and clearly centered on the hole. A blood-red, pulsating light erupted from the chasm's depths, painting the underside of the unseen clouds with a hellish, infernal glow. With it came a stench, a wave of putrescence so vile, so overwhelmingly foul it made me gag and my eyes water. The smell of ancient decay, of primordial rot and sulfur and something else, something indescribably spiritually evil. And then, the true horde began to emerge. Not just skittering scouts or small hunting parties, but legions of them, crawling, slithering, clawing their way over the lip of the hole, a churning, unstoppable tide of chittering, slavering malevolence. They were larger now, more grotesque, some vaguely humanoid but twisted into blasphemous, asymmetrical shapes, their eyes burning with a cold, hateful intelligence. A primal, soul-shattering terror seized me. "We have to fall back! There are too many! We need to run!" I yelled into my radio, my voice cracking with panic. This was beyond anything we could handle. But my colleagues didn't move. Jeremy's return fire was steady, methodical. Sarah, from her fortified position, was calmly picking off targets with her scoped rifle, each shot finding its mark. Caleb was a silent, implacable killing machine, his AR-15 spitting fire. It was Sarah who responded, her voice surprisingly calm amidst the escalating chaos, though strained. "We're not leaving, Alex," she said, her words punctuated by the crack of her rifle. "This moment, this is what our families have been waiting for, preparing for generations." Her ancestors, she explained in short, breathless sentences between shots, like Jeremy's and Caleb's, had been the hereditary guardians of this place, bound by blood oaths centuries old to stand against the darkness within the hole, to be its seal. "I'm sorry, Alex," she added, a note of genuine regret in her voice. "We should have told you the full extent of it sooner. You can go. This isn't your fight, not truly. This is our burden, our curse." I stared dumbfounded at the unfolding apocalypse, her words barely registering over the din of battle and the unearthly shrieks of the attacking creatures. Then Jeremy's voice, rough and weary, cut through my confusion. He elaborated, shouting over the continuous gunfire, that long ago, before recorded history, before even the native tribes had settled this valley, These things had broken free. They had swarmed the land, obliterating an entire ancient city, a civilization whose only record now existed in their family's guarded lore and the cryptic warnings on the hide map. Their ancestors, the few terrified survivors, had somehow, miraculously, managed to drive the horrors back into the hole and had sworn an unbreakable vow passed down through blood and fire to ensure they never escaped again. My mind reeled. This wasn't just a park. It was a prison, a containment zone for an ancient, world-threatening evil. And these people, my colleagues, were its hereditary wardens, the last, thin line. The urge to flee, to save myself, was still a screaming, primal voice in the back of my head. But looking at their determined faces, illuminated by the hellish red light from the hole and the constant muzzle flashes, Jeremy's grim, unyielding resolve, Sarah's fierce maternal protectiveness, Caleb's unwavering silent stance, something shifted deep within me. I had seen the face of this enemy. I had been saved by the forest's other equally terrifying guardians. I might not have their bloodline, their generational duty, but Blackwood Creek had claimed me in its own way, forged me in its crucible of fear. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the foul, sulfurous air burning my lungs, raised my AR-15, sighted on the nearest advancing horror, and flicked the selector to full auto. "No," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, resolute. "I'm staying." The true battle for the whole, for perhaps more than just this forgotten valley, had begun. The engagement escalated into a maelstrom of desperate, brutal violence. We poured automatic fire into the advancing ranks of horrors, the staccato roar of our rifles and shotguns a defiant counterpoint to their unearthly shrieks, guttural roars and chilling, chittering clicks. Explosions rocked the clearing as Jeremy and Caleb began to use the M200 3-launched grenades, each 40 round detonating with a concussive whump, momentarily carving a bloody swath in the monstrous tide, only for the gap to be filled again almost instantly by more surging abominations. The creatures were relentless, driven by a singular malevolent purpose, a hunger that was not merely physical but spiritual, a desire to corrupt and consume. Some were fast and agile, leaping and scuttling with unnatural speed, while others were hulking brutes, their chitinous hides or thick, rubbery flesh shrugging off multiple rifle rounds before finally succumbing to concentrated fire or a point-blank shotgun blast. Their forms were a sickening, ever-shifting bestiary, carapaces gleaming wetly in the pulsating red light from the hole, limbs ending in razor-sharp claws or dripping venomous mandibles, eyes, too many eyes, burning with cold, alien intelligence or stark, rabid hunger. We fought back to back, a small, desperate island of human defiance against an ocean of otherworldly monstrosities. I saw Sarah take a hit, a glancing blow from a whip-like tendril that tore through her sleeve and left a bleeding gash on her arm. But she merely gritted her teeth, hissed a curse, fired back with deadly accuracy, and kept fighting. Caleb moved with a chilling economy of motion, each shot precise, each reload fluid, each movement calculated, but even his implacable defense was being sorely tested by the sheer, overwhelming numbers. We were being systematically pushed back, inch by bloody inch, the perimeter shrinking. The number of them was staggering. It felt like we were trying to hold back the tide with a handful of sand. Despair, cold and insidious, began to claw at the edges of my resolve. Then, just as I thought we were about to be overrun, our ammunition dwindling alarmingly, a new sound joined the cacophony. A series of earth-shattering roars that were not of the whole, but of the deep, ancient forest. From the darkened tree line at the edge of the blighted zone, their forms immense against the hellish red glow, two colossal figures burst forth. Bigfoots. The one who had saved me days before at the hole, and another even larger, its fur the color of midnight, its eyes like burning coals. They charged into the fray like ancient, elemental forces of nature unleashed, their immense fists like granite wrecking balls, their roars filled with a primal territorial fury. They tore into the creatures from the hole with shocking brutality, ripping them apart with their bare hands, their powerful arms flinging mangled bodies aside like broken dolls, their massive feet stamping them into the blighted earth. They weren't fighting for us, I realized with a chilling clarity, but against a common, invasive enemy, an unnatural blight that threatened their ancient domain. As if this intervention wasn't surreal enough, the battlefield changed again, dramatically. A preternatural fog, dense and chillingly familiar, began to roll in with unnatural speed, not from the sky, but seeping from the direction of the distant burial mounds, which lay some miles away but clearly within range of this escalating conflict. It was the Wendigo's mist, cold and cloying. It swirled around the edges of the fighting, and the creatures from the hole that were enveloped by its opaque, ghostly tendrils began to scream in a new, higher pitch of unadulterated terror before being dragged silently, struggling, into its opaque depths. Through momentary horrifying clearings in the vapor, I caught glimpses of an emaciated, impossibly tall silhouette, its familiar deer skull head and massive antlers cutting through the gloom, moving with an impossible spectral speed. The Wendigo, that embodiment of starvation and cold, predatory malice, was now inexplicably on our side, or rather vehemently against the whole spawn. Perhaps these seething, chthonic intruders were an affront to its own ancient, solitary, evil, unnatural competitors in its blighted domain, or simply a disruption to the bleak, frozen order it embodied. I watched in a mixture of awe and profound horror. What even were these beings? The park's native monsters, the ancient, terrifying guardians and spirits of its dark heart, were now locked in a life or death struggle with invaders from an even deeper, more primordial and utterly alien darkness. The battle intensified into a phantasmagoria of violence. We redoubled our efforts, inspired by our unlikely, monstrous allies. Grenades arced through the air, their detonations sending shock waves and shrapnel tearing through the enemy ranks. The continuous deafening chatter of automatic weapons fire was almost overwhelming. The air was thick with a choking cocktail of stenches. Gunpowder, ozone from energy discharges some of the creatures seemed to emit, the Wendigo's breath of ancient ice, the Sasquatch's musky, earthy scent, and the overwhelming fetid, sulfurous odor of the hole's denizens. Yet, despite the unimaginable carnage, their numbers seemed undiminished. For every 10 we, or our monstrous allies, brought down, 20 more seemed to crawl, slither, or ooze from that glowing, hellish abyss. The ground was slick with a kaleidoscope of alien ichor and littered with grotesque, dismembered forms, a truly apocalyptic landscape illuminated by the infernal red light from the hole and the cold, indifferent light of the full moon. The battle raged, a chaotic, nightmarish symphony of roars, shrieks, gunfire, and explosions that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. We were holding, but just barely, the defensive line constantly threatening to break under the sheer, unremitting weight of numbers. The Bigfoots fought with a savage, untiring fury, their powerful, shaggy forms wading through the lesser creatures like animate, ancient battering rams, their blows capable of pulping the smaller abominations outright. The Wendigo's fog was a swirling, lethal vortex on one flank, its chilling presence and spectral attacks as terrifying to the hole's denizens as its initial appearance had been to me. Yet still, they came. An unending, viscous river of malice and alien hunger pouring from the earth's tormented core. Then, a new sound cut through the unrelenting din. A chorus of howls, deep-throated and resonant. Not the singular mournful cry of a lone timber wolf, but the savage, coordinated hunting call of a large pack. From the deep moon-shadowed woods to our west, the territory bordering the turbulent Blackwood River, they emerged. Werewolves. A dozen or more, their massive forms a terrifying, beautiful blend of lupine and human musculature, their eyes glowing with a feral, lambent yellow light in the darkness. Their fur bristled, coarse and dark as the forest night, and their claws, as long and sharp as obsidian knives, glinted in the eerie red light emanating from the hole. They didn't hesitate for a single instant. With a collective blood-curdling snarl that promised swift and brutal death, they launched themselves into the fray, a wave of furred, fanged destruction. They moved with incredible speed and terrifying coordination, tearing into the flanks of the hole's creatures, their powerful jaws snapping bone and carapace, their razor-sharp claws rending chitinous hides and alien flesh with brutal, devastating efficiency. They fought with an inhuman rage, a primal, territorial ferocity that was both terrifying to behold, and, in this desperate, teetering moment, a profoundly welcome reinforcement. The combined, furious assault of 4 human rangers, 2 enraged Sasquatches, 1 spectral Wendigo, and now a full pack of bloodthirsty werewolves finally decisively began to turn the tide. The creatures from the hole, for all their unholy numbers and alien resilience, could not withstand such a multifaceted, ferociously determined onslaught from the awakened, outraged spirits and protectors of Blackwood Creek. Their advance faltered, then broke into a chaotic rout. Some of the larger, more intelligent-seeming abominations let out guttural, screeching commands, and a disorganized, desperate retreat began. Many were cut down as they tried to flee, their strange bodies torn asunder or blasted apart. Others scrambled desperately back towards the abyss, tumbling over each other in their panicked haste to escape the combined, savage wrath of Blackwood Creek's defenders. The forest's own monsters pursued them to the very lip of the hole, ensuring none lingered, their roars and howls a terrifying chorus of victory. The last of the invaders either plunged headlong back into the crimson-lit darkness of their origin, or were torn apart by the relentless Sasquatches and snarling werewolves. As the final unearthly shriek faded into the night, an eerie, profound silence descended upon the battlefield, broken only by our ragged, gasping breaths and the distant, mournful crackling of small fires started by stray explosions amongst the dead trees. The hellish red glow from the hole began to dim, the violent tremors in the earth ceasing. Slowly, cautiously, the Bigfoots, their chests heaving, their dark fur matted with alien gore, retreated, their massive forms melting back into the northern forests without a backward glance or any acknowledgement of our presence. The werewolves, their feral rage subsiding into a wary watchfulness, gave us one long, appraising look with their still glowing eyes, then loped back towards the river, disappearing into the moon-shadowed trees as silently as they had come. The Wendigo's fog thinned and dissipated, the chilling presence receding towards the ancient mounds, as if its grim, unexpected work here was done. None of them had shown any aggression towards us, the human rangers. It was an unspoken temporary truce, a grim alliance born of a shared, greater threat to their respective domains. We stood amidst the carnage, exhausted, battered, but somehow, miraculously, alive. The ground around the hole was a grotesque, nightmarish tableau of alien remains, already beginning to dissolve and decay at an unnatural rate. Sarah was tending to a nasty gash on Jeremy's arm, her face pale but set with grim determination. Caleb was methodically checking our dwindling remaining ammunition, his usual stoicism firmly in place, though his hands trembled slightly. I leaned heavily against a blackened, petrified tree, the adrenaline ebbing away, leaving a bone-deep weariness and a profound, soul-shaking sense of disbelief. We had survived. The hole was, for now, quiescent. In the days that followed, a fragile, wounded peace returned to Blackwood Creek. But something had irrevocably changed for me. I had seen too much, fought alongside nightmares, and stared into an abyss that promised only more horror, more death. The generational burden of guardianship, the endless, terrifying vigil, it was not mine to bear. With a heavy heart, a heart that now knew the true weight of fear, I told Jeremy, Sarah, and Caleb of my decision to leave. They understood. There were no recriminations, only a quiet, weary acceptance in their eyes. They knew this life wasn't for everyone. I packed my truck, the same battered Ford F-150 that had brought me to this hidden, cursed corner of the world. As I drove away from Blackwood Creek Sanctuary, the ancient forest seemed to watch me go, its myriad secrets once again veiled, its silence more profound than ever. Sometimes, even now, years later, I drive back. Not into the park itself. I could never bring myself to do that, but to the small, isolated town nearby. I'll meet Jeremy or Sarah, sometimes both, for a quiet coffee in a dusty diner. They are older, more worn, the lines on their faces deeper, their eyes holding a permanent shadow. But their vigil continues. I always ask, my voice instinctively low, "How's the hole?" So far, the answer has always been the same, delivered with a tired sigh. Quiet. The forest, they say, seems calm, but I know better. In Blackwood Creek, the calm is always deceptive, a thin, fragile crust over an ancient, slumbering, and infinitely patient darkness. And I know, with a certainty that still chills me to the core on sleepless nights, that one day, the hole will stir again, and the Guardians will be waiting,